What's the real problem here? There it is there. The present is the key to the past. Because the Bible says the present is not the key to the past. The Bible says that the past is the key to the present. What happened at the beginning of this book explains the reason why we're in the mess that we're in. So we really need to get a biblical perspective so we can answer the issue of how did an ice age come about. Ice Age. How does it tie in with Noah's flood? How does it tie in with the Bible? What's the big picture? You see, my background is predominantly in geology, and I originally come from a place in Norfolk. For our international friends, that's the bit on the side of the UK which sort of sticks out into the sea. And it is absolutely full of what is called Ice Age deposits or glacial deposits. So I've sort of grown up around these Ice Age rocks, and it's sort of been very fresh in my mind. But to a lot of people, Ice Age is sort of Hollywood movies, you know, great big sheets of ice with mammoths and sloths and saber-toothed tigers running around on them. So we're going to have a look at both the secular side of the argument, as well as let's see if we can get a biblical perspective on this, and let's see if we can use all of this to help us understand the world past, present, and future. Here are my notes that I started scribbling down as we sort of was trying to prepare for this talk, because I've never actually given an Ice Age talk before, not in this way. I mean, it's a question which comes up very commonly in Q&A sessions. It's something that we've touched on in a few of our talks about climate change. We touch on the Ice Age in our brand new documentary, Fire and Ice. So as I'm sort of making all notes and sort of trying to bring all the information together, one thing I realized straight away, there's no way we're going to get through all of this information in just 50 minutes. It just is simply impossible. So here's a few notes. We're not going to get through all of it, but most importantly, we're going to try and give you a biblical perspective, and we're going to try and tie in where the global flood, Noah's flood, actually fits into the Ice Age and fits into the history. Now, just a few weeks ago, I was down on the Isle of Wight, just as we were allowed to travel in the UK again. I was down on the Isle of Wight looking along some Ice Age deposits. These are called the Hempstead beds down there around Baldnor Cliff on sort of the north-west part of the Isle of Wight. And I found this wonderful jawbone. Glue it all back together. It was in many different pieces. It's got a wonderful set of teeth there, and set up here on a display stand, ready to go in our museum collection. Now, we had the privilege of being able to excavate an animal which is regarded to be an Ice Age animal, sort of a small hippopotamus-like creature called Elomix. Now, you may have seen some of the Hollywood movies, and they have some of these sort of small, funny-looking sort of hippo pig-like creatures. Well, this is one of them, and it was living here in the UK before it got buried next to shells, buried in layers. And many of you might think, well, this sounds a lot like a global flood. But there's a small problem. These deposits are nowhere near big enough to be flood deposits. I mean, they only cover a few miles square at the absolute most. It's nothing compared to what we would recognize as flood deposits, like chalk, which covers a huge amount of the Earth's surface, or the Carboniferous deposits, or so on and so forth. So there's definitely something going on here with the Ice Age. Let's get a secular perspective, because when I sat down to start university at age 16, this was my very first textbook that I ever dealt with. Yes, I'm a hoarder. My wife will certainly tell you that. I keep all of my notes. I keep all of my research bits. I keep all of my old books. And this book, book one of Exploring Science, was about global warming. Very, very hot topic today, and it was a hot topic back then when I started when I was 16. And the first 3 chapters of this book is all about the Ice Age. It's all about using the Ice Age as a perspective to actually be able to interpret climate change and global warming and so on and so forth today. Here's a picture from that very book. You can see it there, Brandon and Robinson, 2011. This is a picture of Earth's surface temperature over the last 2 billion years. Of course, I don't believe in these dates. Simon doesn't believe in these dates, but we're just going with this at the moment because we're trying to get a secular perspective of what the Ice Age is about. And you actually notice, can you see all of these cold spots? I mean, this is your mean or your average global temperature. On the right-hand column, you've got the warm. On the left-hand column, you've got the cold. And you can see how Earth's temperature has fluctuated, or supposedly fluctuated, over the last 2 billion years. And you've got some really, really cold spots, some really, really warm spots. And in the last sort of 1.8 million years or so, 2 million years, during the Quaternary, you have lots and lots of these little cold patches, which you can see right at the top of the columns there. Now, these are what we would consider to be the sort of ice ages, or what secular science would consider to be the ice ages of the Hollywood movies and the ice age you hear about with the wonderful different animals there. And they would argue that there were multiple ice ages because, well, let's face it, how many ice ages have you seen in the last few years? You see, there's a puzzle that it comes to creating an ice age. You need to have perfect conditions. And it's so spectacularly, specific, the conditions that you actually need. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. That the argument is, in order to produce all of the ice age deposits that we see around the world, you'd have had to have multiple ice ages. In fact, up to 30 different ice ages over the last 2 million years or so. So this is your secular perspective of cold, of warm, of cold, of warm. Now, as a side point, it's interesting to note that geologically, Earth's climate has been going up and down and up and down and up and down over the past, well, as long as the Earth has been around, whether you believe that to be 2 billion years or whether you believe that to be just 6,000 years. There's evidence from the fossil record, from the geologic record, that Earth's climate goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. I wonder if that can give us a biblical perspective on the modern climate change phenomena. This is your conclusion. According to secular history, there has been huge fluctuation in global temperatures over the past 2 billion years. This is what they believe, including multiple of these ice ages, and the most condensed and the most amount of ice ages have been in the last 2 million years or so. Okay, so let's ask this question. What is the cause of an ice age? Now, if you put this into Google, just say what caused the ice age, you'll get about 50 different answers, right? And I had a very interesting conversation with my first ever professor that I had, the guy who was teaching me this book, The Stuff on Global Warming. He was a meteorologist with a physics background. He studied past environmental changes. And this was a conversation that I had with him, Dr. Chris Ashley. I said, so what caused the ice age? This was at the end of a lecture. We were talking about the ice ages and global warming and the evidence for it and so on and so forth. And he'd never touched on what actually caused the ice age. And so I asked him, I said, what caused the ice age? He said, when you find out, do let me know. And I said, what do you mean you don't know what caused the ice age? And he said this. He said, I mean, there isn't a single scientist or climatologist alive today who knows the answer. They may try and give an explanation using the position of the Earth, its rotation, distance from the sun, and so on. But the reality is that none of them hold up to any scientific scrutiny. The cause of the multiple ice ages evident in Earth's history is the greatest mystery in science today. Interesting. I mean, here's an expert in his field who studies the past environmental change, who studies ice ages, and even he's saying, I don't really have a clue how an ice age forms. Now, I wonder why there's this puzzle, because the reason that this whole sort of ice age thing is a mystery is because you need to have a paradox in place in order to actually produce an ice age. You need to have two opposing issues. What are we talking about? Well, let's start with a question. What is the most effective, or you could say the worst, greenhouse gas? Well, according to the modern climate change sort of proponents, you may well think that it's something like methane, or something like carbon dioxide, or something like argon. I mean, these are all the gases that we hear about, and an increase of carbon dioxide and so on and so forth. But the reality is the most effective greenhouse gas is actually water, or water vapor, water in gaseous form. You see, water is actually an extremely effective insulator of heat. It will hold heat very well, but it takes quite a lot of heat to actually warm it up. Now, that's key to understanding this issue about how to actually form an ice age. There's a picture of our Earth from a certain angle, looking sort of straight at the Pacific. Hey, I'm sure this was going to be mentioned at some point today, but I wonder where all the floodwater came from and where did it go? Well, you just have to look at this picture to really get your answer. There is a lot of water on the Earth. That's brilliant for actually designing a planet for life. I mean, you can see God's geniuses in actually creating the Earth, and it was the planet which he created for the sole purpose of creating life and creating human beings in his image. And water is brilliant for this because water holds heat very well. It warms the atmosphere, and it actually, I mean, we're in England, and let's face it, we're on the same sort of level as Hudson Bay in Canada, where the polar bears come down and walk around. What keeps us warm? Water does. It's the Gulf Stream coming up from Mexico. It means that we can have sort of anything from a temperate to almost a subtropical climate in some places of the UK. We were recently down on the Isle of Wight, and in this very little bit where the water comes in and warms the little corner, it raises the temperature by 5 degrees in that area, and it's able to grow Mediterranean sort of plants. It's a wonderful design to actually create an Earth full of water, but it's the water that holds the key to an ice age. You see, you've heard of the greenhouse effect. It's been in the media everywhere now. I mean, the greenhouse effect is a good thing in the grand scheme of things, because it stops the heat from the sun escaping back out into space. So our atmosphere is brilliantly designed so that as the sun comes in, it magnifies the light and warms the Earth nicely and stops all of that heat from bouncing back out again. Now, the problem when it comes to creating an ice age is you need a huge amount of evaporation. You need lots and lots of water evaporating into the atmosphere. And of course, in order to evaporate water, you need lots and lots of heat. You need the water to be warm in order to evaporate it. So you need very warm water to create lots of evaporation to go up into the atmosphere, but you also need a very, very cold atmosphere. You need a cold atmosphere so that you can actually freeze your water particles and bring it back onto the land as snow and ice. Hang on, we've got a problem here. You need very warm water, you need very, very cold atmosphere, and the problem is, if the sun is the primary source of heat, then both the atmosphere and the oceans will be warm, because the sun has to pass through the atmosphere in order to warm the oceans. Therefore, the atmosphere is going to be warm. And if you try and block off the atmosphere by sending up lots of particles or sending up lots of, ash and stuff into the atmosphere, which will block out sunlight, then the waters will be cold, because the primary source of heat is actually from your sun. Now, this is why it's such a big puzzle to secular geology, because, well, secular geologists have a certain view of how to interpret geology, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But really, you need to have ideal conditions in order to make an ice age. It's extremely rare and extremely catastrophic. There needs to be huge changes in the way that we view the Earth today in order to actually create a vast amount of ice. Now, currently today, the Earth has about 10% ice on it, or 10% of the land mass is covered in glacier. Whereas during the Ice Age, the evidence shows that nearly up to 30% of land mass was covered in ice. I mean, that's a huge increase. Interesting. Ice Age paradox. In order to create an ice age, you actually need warm oceans and a cool atmosphere. And if the primary source of heat is from the sun, you simply cannot get that using the conditions that we have today. Now, I say using the conditions that we have today, and that's important because it gives us that perspective on geology. It gives us that sort of background to the way that the geologist mind thinks, because geologists have become, whether you want to call it indoctrinated or whether you want to call it, taught from day one or sort of duped or whatever you want to call it, there is definitely a way of thinking in geology today. I experienced it going through university, and it's taught to you from day one. And you have to interpret geology around this, even if it's not openly stated that you do. What are we actually talking about? Well, let's have a look at sort of the background to the Ice Age. Here's your temperature graph. Remember, Earth's temperature over the last 2 billion years, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm. Now, where did we actually get this 2 billion figure from, or 2 billion year figure from? Well, it has everything to do with the way that you view geology. Here's Louis. He was really the first person who put forward the idea of an ice age. He was over in America. He was actually from Switzerland. He was over in America studying the Great Plains, looking at great big scratches in the rock, and he found some rather interesting things. Great big glacial sands, all stacked up on top of one another, formed by glaciers in the middle of a desert. He found these flood rocks at the bottom with a huge amount of this glacial sand on top. There's the boundary line just there. You can see the hard shale on the bottom. You can see the glacial sands on the top. And he said, hey, this evidence shows that at some point there must have been glaciers here. At some point there must have been snow and ice here. And so he was really the first person to put forward the idea of a sort of an ice age, a time when ice covered most of Northern Europe and North America. And he was claimed to be a Christian. He believed in the Bible. He had a few funny ideas that we probably wouldn't go with today, but he certainly started from the Bible, and it seems later on in life he got influenced by a few prominent figures like Charles Lyell. And this is where the real problem comes in for the Ice Age. This is why it's such a mystery to scientists. This is why when you Google what caused the Ice Age, you get so many different answers. It's because they're all viewing things through Charles Lyell's and Charles Darwin's glasses. Who was Charles Lyell? Well, he sort of popularized the principle of uniformitarianism. Oh, this whole sort of idea of evolution and millions of years is not a new idea in the slightest. I mean, you can trace it all the way back to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. It's a very, very old and ancient idea, which kind of got redug up and then reinvented, if you like, during the sort of 18th and 19th century. But this was his catchphrase here. You can see this is in the Natural History Museum in London, where he took this photograph. You can see his catchphrase there: the present is the key to the past. In other words, if you want to explain geology, you have to do it using events and principles that are in play today. This is why most geologists are so against a global flood, apart from the obvious thing that they don't want to admit that there's a God, or the potential fact that there's a God who can judge. But they've been trained to think, well, I don't see any global floods today. Therefore, there couldn't possibly be a global flood in the past, because I have to explain geology using principles that I observe today. And Lyell and Darwin actually, they knew each other. Lyell was actually Darwin's mentor. Darwin took a copy of the Principles of Geology, which was Lyell's book, with him on the Beagle, so he was heavily influenced. Charles Darwin even admitted that most of his ideas came out of Lyell's brain, and they put forward a philosophy which has affected geology and, in fact, most of the sort of, even the biological and evolutionary sciences today. Let me give you a brief explanation of what we call. We're on a field trip here, creation research field trip, digging up rocks that we call Ordovician. Ordovician, by the way, is named after the Celtic tribe that used to live in Wales. Nothing to do with millions of years or evolution in the slightest. And we find some wonderful fossils on these field trips. You can see the modern snail shell on the right. You can see the fossil snail shell on the left. You see, Lyell and Darwin actually put forward a principle of how to date these things, which had nothing to do with evidence in the slightest. All they simply did is guess that it would take around 20 million years to evolve one species of snail into another species of snail. Therefore, if you count all the snails up, the Ordovician has to be at least 240 million years old. This was documented on their field trip. They went to this place, same place that Creation Research went to. And it's documented that they stood together and said, well, if it takes millions of years to evolve, therefore 20 million years from one snail into another snail, count up all the different snails, 240 million years old. Now, not a scientist on Earth believes that the Ordovician is 240 million years old in the slightest today. They believe that it's over 400 million years old. The world has definitely gotten older. But look at where it all started. From pure guesswork. It's interesting where it actually comes from. You see, what Charles Lyell really pushed across was not just only evolution with Darwin, but also this anti-catastrophism, anti any large catastrophe like Noah's flood. And he promoted the idea that you can tell the age of a rock by the fossils which are found inside of it, just like he did with the snails. Darwin aged the Earth even more, and all of a sudden you had 600 million years plus. Long before the invention of radioactive dating or all of the modern dating methods, it came out of pure conjecture, pure hypothesis, pure just having a look at the rocks and making guesswork. But what it really did was implant this present is the key to the past into people's minds, which affected the way that we view geology. And it also explains why we can't get a solution from secular science about what caused the Ice Age. By the way, what were Charles Lyell's motives for creating a really old Earth, for promoting the present is the key to the past? Well, he actually wrote what his motive was. He said, I conceived the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever the Mosaic geology, that's flood geology or explaining geology using the books of Moses, as in Genesis, Noah's flood, could be set down without giving offense, it would be an historical sketch. And you must extract mine in order to say as little possible of yourself. What he's really saying is, I want to get rid of this Mosaic idea by creating a new history. I mean, even Stephen Gould admitted that Charles Lyell was a lawyer by profession, and his book is one of the most brilliant briefs ever published by an advocate. Lyell relied upon the true bits of cunning to establish his uniformitarian views as the only true geology. First, he set up a straw man to demolish. In fact, the catastrophists were much more empirically minded than Lyell. The geological record does seem to acquire catastrophes. Rocks are fractured and contorted, whole faunas are wiped out. Now, although modern geology has come back to the idea of perhaps there were some catastrophes, they have not yet come back to the acceptance of the global flood described in Genesis. But regardless of this sort of slowly coming back to catastrophism, that principle of the present being the key to the past is lodged into the underpinning of most modern secular geology, and it means that you get great big issues when trying to explain things like an ice age. Because the Bible says the present is not the key to the past. The Bible says that the past is the key to the present. What happened at the beginning of this book explains what the reason why we're in the mess that we're in. It explains the history of Earth. It explains the creation, the fall of mankind, the global judgment that God gave to the earth, which affected the way that we can live today, and also the spreading out of all the people into many nations at the Tower of Babel. So we really need to get a biblical perspective so we can answer the issue of how did an ice age come about. And note very well, this is sort of a side point, but note very, very important here. Any dating method, geological dating method, which includes carbon-14, starlight being the same speed, radioactive dates or chalk and limestone formation, so on and so forth, or any geological history which is based upon Lyell's uniformitarian assumptions, will always contradict the biblical account of six-day creation and the Noah's flood, because it is not the evidence that disagrees with the biblical record of the six-day creation and Noah's flood over the last 6,000 to 7,000 years, but it's the opinions of men who willfully set out to reject and replace the word of God. Make sure you bear this in mind, and once you come to that realization and you get to be able to look past that, a whole new world will open up, and you'll be able to answer questions like what caused the ice age, how did these fossils get here, what are the fossils doing on top of Mount Everest, and so on and so forth. The point, if you take the pagan-inspired philosophy that Lyell and Darwin promoted as your authority, then you are always going to have issues accepting the Bible's version of events. But do realize it's not the issue of evidence, it's an issue of who or what is your authority. Make sure that your authority is the word of God, the scripture which is all inspired. That being said, now we've sort of given you a background to the Ice Age. We've looked at the secular perspective. We've looked at sort of where is the problem really lie? It lies in this uniformitarian idea. Let's get a biblical perspective of the Ice Age, and let's try and see if we can dig in and get a solution and have a look at the real evidence there. Starting point, Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Now, you and I tend to view that word good as a moral word, and it is. But bear in mind, when God says something is good, he means it is good in the all-encompassing definition. In the beginning, in creation, everything was very good. God made the world very good, and we can also get some little sort of climate clues about what the world was like back there, because in Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, it says, and they, talking about Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Now, you've got quite a lot going on here in this little Bible verse, aside from the fact that you have the first mention of man and wife, and that's really important. It lays down the basis for marriage, that God created Adam in his image, created woman out of man. They were both naked. There was no sin around. There was no need to be ashamed of your nakedness. But what little climate clue can we get from this? I mean, God created the world and he put Adam and Eve in a garden and they were both naked. It clearly wasn't going to get very cold during day or night because they had no clothes. And also the atmosphere must have been different. And this is whether or not you buy into the idea of sort of a water vapor canopy. I don't personally myself, I don't think Answers in Genesis take that line either, but correct me if I'm wrong. But regardless of what you take about the sort of the waters above the firmament, we know that the climate had to be different because they were both naked and they weren't getting sunburned, because sunburn is not good. It creates cancer, right? You have to have an environment where a man and a woman can be naked in, not be cold, can survive good, not get sunburned, no extremes, a pleasant place to live. Interesting little climate clue. According to the Bible, when God created man, when everything was created in the beginning, everything was very good. Man and woman were naked and they were able to survive very, very happily. Remember that point. God saw everything he made. Behold, it was very good. We have a clue about what the climate was like at the beginning of creation. We have other clues as well about what the climate was like at creation, or very soon after creation, certainly before Noah's flood. Here's our international director, John Mackay, kneeling next to a very large rock, which he had to get several people to help him carry off the beach. Yes, we love carrying big rocks off the beach, and no, our backs do not thank us. And yes, we're both looking forward to a new heavens and a new earth when we can have new backs. But have a look at this wonderful trackway. You see that is just underneath his hand, sort of curves around the rock there. This is a insect trackway. I mean, just look at the size of the insect trackway next to the size of John. This must have been a pretty big insect, or at least, sorry, not an insect. It was an invertebrate trackway. It's not an insect at all. It's actually an arthropod. It's a giant centipede. Hey, you see the little kid next to it? How would you like to come across one of those in your garden? But you see, we know the atmosphere had to be different because there's no way that a modern atmosphere would be able to actually cope with a creature like this anymore. You need a warmer, a more pleasant atmosphere, something which hasn't got extremes in it in order to create something this big, or dragonflies with a meter wingspan. Hey, that's a big bug there. Yeah, the climate was warm when God created. And then you follow forward and we get to the topic of this webinar, the global flood, and you have major climate change. The fountains of the great deep burst open, 40 days and 40 nights of rain, the earth being ripped apart and completely changed. And after the flood, you have the first ever reference to climate change. You have the first ever reference to different seasons. You have the first ever reference to cold. Genesis chapter 8, verse 22. God promised Noah that until the end of the world, there will be seed time, there'll be harvest, there'll be cold, there'll be heat, there will be summer, and there will be winter. The first ever mention of it in the Bible. By the way, you want a biblical perspective on climate change, a biblical perspective on global warming and environmentalism? Here it is here. God's promised us that until the end of the world, there'll be seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, and winter. Make sure that you have a biblical perspective of a God who is a sovereign God and is actually in control of the weather and the climates. So here's your real history of weather. It was warm and cool. It was pleasant in the beginning. Then you have the first ever mention of rain in the Bible. You have the first ever mention of cold. You have the first ever mention of winter and summer and different seasons at Noah's flood. And then all of a sudden in the book of Job, which is regarded by many biblical scholars to be one of the oldest books in the Bible, and to be sort of taking place not too long after Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel, and you have a mention of ice, you have a mention of snow, and you have mention of hail. Let's have a look at some of these Bible verses, because the Bible doesn't talk about ice and snow very much, sort of being based in the Middle East. But Job, who certainly was based in that sort of Middle Eastern area, mentions ice and snow quite a bit. And he uses it in a way that can only be related to it. You have to be able to relate to the ice and snow. You could use the same argument as a lot of creationist and Bible scholars would use when talking about things like Behemoth and Leviathan and it being a dinosaur. I mean, Job must have known what these creatures were because he was talking about them. They're a relatable text. It's the same when it comes to the snow and the ice that he mentions. In Job 4, verse 19, Job is talking to his friends and says that heat and drought remove melting snow, so does the grave take those who sin. In order for the second part, the second bit of the poetry to make sense, the first bit has to be something relatable. Heat and snow. Job states that his friends are like streams darkened with thawing ice and overflowing from melting ice and snow. There's not a lot of snow going on at the Middle East. In modern times, one of his friends describes God as the one who tells the snow and the rain to pour down on the earth. Even though his friends had got the wrong end of the stick when they were trying to condemn Job, it's actually a very important point that he's making here. God is the one who is in control of the weather, but hey, they knew about snow and rain and ice, and it's interesting, isn't it, to think about this sort of in-between period. It gives us a clue as to when this icy period could have actually taken place. And even God himself asks Job, have you been into the places where all the snow and the hail are stored? Job couldn't possibly have done that, but he had to know about snow and hail in order for that to have made sense. And God also asks Job, who gave birth to the ice and the frost? Some climate clues about time after the flood. Real history of weather? Okay, according to the Bible, then, if you take a biblical picture recorded in the Old Testament, the earth has been warm, and it's been cold, and now it's warmed back up again. It's gone up, it's gone down, it's gone up, it's gone down, just like God promised Noah that it would be. Okay, where does the Ice Age fit in? Well, first off, let's have a look. What evidence is there for an ice age? I mean, again, we think ice age, we think vast ages, we think, huge time periods where the earth was covered with ice and mammoths walking on the ice and so on and so forth. The reality is we won't have time to cover things like mammoths and the animals and stuff, but just think about it logically for a moment. I mean, I've worked with animals. I worked as a zookeeper for nearly 6 years. I briefly got to experience working with some elephants. They eat a lot of food, and that's an understatement, right? They go through a huge amount of food. There's no way you'd be able to get an elephant-like creature surviving on the ice, on like an ice sheet like you see in the movies. No, they would have been where there was grass and stuff. So you've got to get a big perspective, first of all, but what actual evidence is there for an ice age? Well, what we have is evidence of a time in Earth's history when there was a lot of glaciers on the planet. If you get our DVD Fire and Ice from our web store, you'll actually see we climbed up a glacier and got to experience it. It's a wonderful and amazing experience, but one thing that glaciers do is they advance, they move forward. And as they move forward, they carry lots and lots of grit, they carry lots and lots of stones and stuff that they've picked up along the way. And ice is pretty sharp at the best of times, and they leave behind scratches. So you can tell where glaciers and ice has been because it leaves scratches in the rock, scratches like these you can see on the screen there. Huge, great big scratches that run along this sort of flat bed where the ice has been. Scratches that are all pointing in the same direction. So you can certainly see where ice has been and where glaciers have been, and you also have the leftovers of where the glaciers have stopped. Now, what we're looking at here is what we would call a glacial till, or a large sort of glacial deposit. This is actually a photo which I took. It's from a place called West Runton, which is on the Norfolk coast. The ice was coming down from the North Pole, basically, and as it came down, it stopped. It sort of cut across East Anglia. And this is the end result of it. What you have is, as the ice is moving, it's picking up sands, it's picking up fossils, it's grinding chalk into pieces, and it's actually dumping it down in front of it and leaving these wonderful, great big glacial deposits, these glacial stands. In fact, you have a really interesting feature here at West Runton. You can see the sort of dark rock at the bottom. That's glacial, that's formed by the ice as it pushes itself along, and then it's actually sitting underneath flood deposited rock, the chalk. Now, it's not as freaky of nature as you might think, because what's actually happened here is the huge sheet of ice has smashed into the great big rock face of chalk and has actually forced it to be shoved up and over on top of it where the glacial rock has been sitting. So you've got huge forces at play here of ice sheets that shove huge, great big amounts of rock on top of one another. You have this till, which is laid down in bands as the ice is melting, and as the ice melts and it begins to run down, it carries the sediment which the ice has been carrying along, and it dumps it in great big, these sort of riverbed plains which run down into the sea. You see evidence like this. You see evidence of where you see the big sort of circles there, where the ice has carved into the chalk and dumped down all of the sediment on top. You see, there's lots of evidence that at some point in Earth's history, there was a period when around 30% of the land mass at the poles was actually covered in ice. Predominantly in the north, but also a little bit to the south. What we're looking at here, and let's see if I can actually get a little pointer onto the screen, because that would probably be useful. Laser pointer, there we go. Right, what we're actually looking at here is a topographic map. It's been a map. It's been highlighted in certain areas to show altitude. So have a look at this red area. Can you see this sort of red curve that comes around this area? What this is referred to, this is the top part of Norfolk, by the way. You've got the sea up here, you've got the land. Here it comes in down here, sort of Blakeney in the area. And you've got this here, which is called the Cromer Ridge, or the Cromer Forest Ridge. Now, this is a huge dump of basically sand and stones. What you have is you have the ice coming down from the top direction, and it's actually shoving all of these stones in front of it, and it leaves it in a huge, great big ridge along here, which is actually the remnants of where the ice stopped. So you can actually put it up on a map, and you can see this bit here. This is where the ice would have stopped, the ice sheet. It's a lot steeper on this side than on this side. There is the actual map, so you can see where it is. It's a lot steeper here, and then it goes narrow down here. There's a great big ridge running along here. You can see there's not many houses and stuff on it, because this is where the ridge has basically stopped. I mean, you can just stand down on the beach and see this huge ridge above you. It's quite remarkable, the mark that the ice has left on the landscape, the glaciers has left on the landscape. So for an ice age, you can call it an ice age if you want, but there certainly does seem to be, from the evidence, from the scientific evidence, a time in Earth's past where a good proportion of the world was covered in ice. These are the latest estimates. You can see it's mostly in the north, but it's also a little bit down in Australia as well, and New Zealand, this sort of area. I've actually been to these places in Tasmania in the south of Australia and seen the scratches myself. But it's predominantly up here in the north part, around 30% of this ice actually being covered. And there's your picture of the ice covering the land that we can see from a sort of a top view. But what's really interesting is, do you notice how much of the sea is actually frozen? I mean, if all of this is frozen over here, why is this sea not frozen? Remember our paradox? You need to have warm oceans, and you need to have a very cold atmosphere in order to produce this phenomena. So what's actually going on here? Let's try and get that final biblical perspective as we wrap up, and try and see if the Bible, if Noah's flood, can give us a good explanation. Remember what we need? We need warm oceans, and we need a cool atmosphere. All of this needs to be in place in order to actually produce an ice age. Well, let's start first of all with the warm oceans. On that day, the fountains of the great deep were broken open, and the windows of heaven were opened. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. Now, we don't have time in this presentation to talk about the fountains of the great deep in depth, because there's different sort of perspectives on it. Some people envisage it as like a great big geyser. Other people envisage it as the earth splitting apart, and all of the water gushing out from underneath the earth's crust. Or you've got sort of the flood or catastrophic plate tectonics, where the land basically moves down and lets the water that's already there flood over the earth. It's a fascinating thing to discuss and go into it. We don't have time. The only point you need to realize here is what the Bible is describing is a huge amount of tectonic activity, of earth being ripped up, of moving around, and vast swathes of this sort of material, this hot molten material being dumped into the water. You see, what the flood will do is produce a large amount of volcanic and tectonic activity, huge amounts, things that we'd never even experienced before on the earth, and things that we'll never experience again. And we've got God's promise to thank for that he gave at the end of the flood. But you can see why, if the flood is actually, if this huge amount of volcanic and tectonic activity is required to produce an ice age, then you can see why the secular scientists are having so much trouble, because we don't see anything of this scale on the Earth today. What it would also have done is created an increased amount of aerosols and dust particles in the atmosphere. Now, we have a wonderful atmosphere which protects us. We also have something else. When I was in Iceland and on our honeymoon / filming trip, we got the privilege of being able to see the Northern Lights. Now, the Northern Lights is essentially where particles in the upper atmosphere react with the Earth's magnetic field and end up producing this beautiful display. But it's that magnetic field which is important, because the magnetic field will actually suck in these particles into the upper atmosphere and concentrate them around the poles. Now, that's important because what you would actually have is a reversed greenhouse effect. Or the greenhouse effect, the light comes in and it gets trapped inside the atmosphere, so the Earth is warmer. That sort of gap underneath the atmosphere is warmer. Whereas reversed is that the sunlight comes down and bounces straight back off. It can't actually get down onto the Earth's surface. Therefore, the Earth's surface in the poles actually starts to get a lot cooler on the land. You've now got a very, very cool atmosphere and you've got a very, very cool land. But what you have is a global flood which has ripped up the Earth's surface, churned a huge amount of tectonic and heat activity into the waters, and flood currents will force the warm waters up to the poles. Just like we have the Gulf Stream here in the UK, which carries warm water from the equator up here to, well, pretty much close to the Arctic. We're surprisingly close to the Arctic if you actually give a full perspective on it. And the flood currents would have forced the warm waters up to the poles, where these warm waters would have stopped the sea from freezing. But up around the poles, you've got very cold atmosphere. So all of a sudden, you're producing huge amounts of evaporation into the atmosphere around these warm water in the poles, but it's very cold in the atmosphere, very cold on the land. And all of a sudden, you have the perfect conditions to produce an ice age. And you can only get these conditions if you actually have a global phenomena. I mean, the opening of the fountains of the Great Deep and then the resulting worldwide flood would have caused upheavals. It would have caused this volcanic activity and all of these aerosols going into the atmosphere and producing this trap. It just creates the perfect condition to actually end up producing an ice age. Now, what about the time scale? Because obviously we had a look at the 2 billion years of history, and the last 30-odd ice ages are supposed to have happened in the last 2 million years. Well, Mike Oard is pretty much the authority when it comes to dealing with the ice age and meteorology in the creation world. He's done a wonderful amount of work, and he says this. He says, I have calculated that at the height of the ice age, the average depth of ice cover over much of the northern hemisphere was approximately 2,300 feet, which is 701 meters, and that it took about 500 years to accumulate to that depth. This approximation was calculated by estimating the sources of water vapor, including evaporation from the warm ocean at mid and high latitude as it cooled, and transport from low latitudes to higher latitudes. In other words, if you take the flood, if you take the Bible, God's word, as your authority, and you take the global flood described in Genesis as a real event, and you actually put that into your computer models and work backwards, you can actually get to only 500 years to accumulate all of the ice necessary to produce all of the evidence for the ice that we see today. You simply don't need multiple ice ages over the last 2 million years. You don't even need the 2 million years, because that interpretation comes from that point that Charles Lyell was coming from, that the present is the key to the past, and that you would need such unique events. And well, let's face it, you do need a unique event, but then it happens so rarely, you'll need at least 2 million years in order to actually produce it. But you take the Bible as your authority, like Mike has done, and you end up getting, well, you don't actually need more than 500 years to create all of the ice. What about getting rid of the ice? He says if we apply the melt equation to the ice sheet melt back, which is about 33 feet per year or 10 meters per year along the edge, but slower in the interior, the gigantic glacial ice sheets would have melted within 200 years. So you've got around 700 years in total for the ice age. Now, as flood happens, the first ever climate change happens, the Earth's atmosphere has changed, we have unique conditions to produce an ice age, which comes on within a few hundred years and disappears within just a couple, which also gives us that biblical perspective of Job, because it puts Job right about the mid to end part of the ice age. You've now got a fuller perspective, and one that is actually in light of the Bible. See, as always, the Bible gives us the answer, and it's related directly to the global flood that the Genesis describes that happened in Noah's day. This is more as just an interesting thing. You'll actually find this on our documentary, and I included it because we deal briefly with the Ice Age there. This is over 500 different data points that we put in, all recorded from both geology and from real records. It's Iceland's climate history from a biblical perspective. We put it into a biblical perspective, which is the last 4,000 years or so. And you have warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, including that a little bit at the bottom there at around 3,200 years, where you can see the Ice Age, a great sudden drop on Earth's temperature, having gone from previously being very warm, a Mediterranean climate up in Iceland, down to the bottom, back up again, back down again, and so on and so forth. Cyclic climate, which is described in the Bible when God promises Noah that for as long as the earth shall remain, you will have cold, heat, summer, winter, seed time, and harvest.